Almost any time there's a significant border anomaly or a completely straight border, I almost always assume it was drawn by people who didn't live there. While this tends to boast its fair share of problems, it also tends to draw my attention to discuss not only the history of why it exists, but also what exists within it. Hello and welcome to another episode of Focusing on One Specific Topic. If you're new to Nick Geo, welcome. My name is Nick, and I cover geographical topics ranging anywhere from breaking down entire US states to historical or cultural significance inside a country, worldwide topics in a list format, and travel. Today I want to take a look at a part of Afghanistan that sort of shoots off of the rest of the country, known as the Wakhan corridor. First and foremost, this panhandle is part of the greater Badakhshan province, one of the 34 provinces that makes up the country. It's sandwiched between Tajikistan to the north, Pakistan to the south, and the end of it actually gives it a tiny border with China in the Xinjiang province. This is part of a greater valley simply called the Wakhan Valley. However, more specifically, the whole panhandle consists of the Wakhan Range, Wakhan Corridor, this is the part of the valley that falls in Afghanistan specifically, and the Karakoram Range. Primarily, the borders on either side of it include the Panj and Pamir River to the north with Tajikistan, and the Hindu Kush Range to the south, which is where you'll find the dreaded Durand Line. The Wakhan River runs pretty evenly through the middle of all this, giving it the name that it has. Apparently, locals like to call this the roof of the world, and it is largely cut off from the rest of Afghanistan, being remote and isolated from much of the Afghan people and government. In fact, until full Taliban takeover in 2021, most of the folks living here weren't even aware of any of the wars or conflicts going on in the more populated parts of the nation. Most of the region does not have any roads, the only big exception would be the Pamir Highway, and the populations that inhabit this live on their own in the mountains. Two main ethnic groups dominate these sparsely populated parts, namely the Wakhi and actually the Kyrgyz. The Wakhi will often have two homes, one for the winter time and one for the summer. As you can imagine, the seasons get rather extreme here, and the Kyrgyz are more nomadic, a common feature amongst early Turkic groups moving around in yurts. Both populations raise livestock, primarily goats, sheep, and yak, and can trade with neighboring nations or other Afghans, depending on the geopolitical situation, as it is rather tough to grow food and attain goods like clothing in these altitudes. There are alpine grasslands that definitely help with the wildlife aspect of this, however. Looking at the Wakhi people, they're an Iranian ethnic group with thousands of years of heritage, practicing the Ismaili sect of Islam and speaking a Wakhi language that has Persian roots. These people are very passionate about music, with unique instruments such as the rubab, the dandang, the kupuj, daf, and sona, and they play a sport called buzkashi. This is a sport where they ride on horseback to carry a goat carcass past a goal. Historically, Wakhan has some of the big claims to fame, as the Silk Road did run along here, with stops being made by Marco Polo, Song Yun, and Alexander the Great, but if you know my channel well enough by now, you know I prefer a deeper historic dive. Much of the purpose of treading this extremely rugged and harsh geography was the fact that it worked as a nice trade route between Kabul, the current Afghan capital, and Kashgar, with modern Chinese province of Xinjiang. Historically, there were three routes that passed through this, and it was also not common for medieval Europeans such as Jesuit priests to walk this way as a means to reach China. But it wouldn't be long until those pesky European empires would have their eyes on this, primarily the British and the Russians. You see, the mid-19th century saw the creation of British India, or the British Raj, which encompassed all of modern-day Pakistan as well. But just north, you had Central Asian excursions spearheaded by the Russian Empire as it moved on to conquer the Turkic regions and dominate much of the continent. This led to something known as the Great Game, which saw the two superpowers looking for dominance in Afghanistan, Tibet, and Persia. Why was it called this? Well, that term actually goes back to earlier imperial expansions, which had a lot of risks, and both empires saw the other getting these regions as a threat, should Russia choose to invade India or the British choose to invade the Russian Empire. Thus, in 1873, the borders that would become the Wakhan corridor would keep these two at bay, and the tiny strip would remain ruled by Afghans. Because God knows that both of these empires needed even more land than they already controlled. Anywho, the Panj and Pamir rivers still separate Afghanistan from Tajikistan today, where they held back the Russians, and the accursed Durand Line that separates it from modern Pakistan goes back to the British borders. Wow, as you might have imagined, this is what sparked all the conflict that we still see to this day on the Durand Line. Through to the 20th century, much of this would stay closed off, with only one rugged road from Ishkashim to Sarad Aborgil, and random paths that run all the way to China's border. As I said, life would remain rather unique for the locals, being mostly unaware of regime changes and the wars with the Soviet Union and the United States, and it took complete Taliban takeover before any government made their presence known. So within the Wakhan corridor, there actually exist Buddhist monasteries, meaning Islam isn't the only religion that ties here. You can find these mainly along the Pamir River, which is where ancient civilizations tended to build their settlements. Further, you can find the Yamchun Castle, or what remains of it at least, on a steep cliff between two valleys. There are actually a total of 40 towers around the citadel, known locally as the Castle of Fire Worshippers, that likely refers to ancient Zoroastrian practices of the Iranian people groups dating back to the 3rd century BC. The Wakhan Valley actually has another castle called the Kaka Palace Castle, and both of these are evidence of the importance of this route in world trade and the cultural exchange. This was likely relevant all the way until the collapse of the Mughal Empire and the establishment of maritime trade routes. Considering China's Belt and Road Initiative, there has been thought of restoring the route's significance with a railroad. However, that would require the same level of attention from Iran. This would be huge, as it would give potential for more direct lines from China to the west and even North Africa without needing to cut through Central Asia and the freezing, desolate plains of Siberia. Something interesting, this entire region is actually known as the Wakhan National Park, which helps provide protection and habitat for much of the wildlife, especially the endangered species, including the Marco Polo sheep. This means there are indeed carnivores, including wolves, but obviously there are slim pickings for prey, as well as plants for the herbivores, and of course for hunters. Much as I'd like to go on, I did intend on keeping this brief, so we're going to cut it off there. Thank you for checking out this little overlooked piece of Central Asia. If you've been here, have any experience to share, or would like to visit, be sure to leave a comment, and I will talk to you next time.